welcome everyone. My name is Matt Dawson and I'm here with Peter Oldmeadow, a scholar, philosopher and Dharma practitioner. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Today we're in Taree in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It's a wonderful Sunday, Easter Sunday here, the 4th of April, and we have the opportunity to see what Peter has to say about a few things. First of all, Peter, might you want to just say something about how you came to Buddhism and your previous roles in university as a lecturer and professor in the areas of Indian philosophy?
Okay, yes, thanks Matt. Well, of course, coming to Buddhism, there's always multiple factors and it's difficult to pin down exactly where it all started. But as you know, I was born in India, so that probably had some bearing on the matter. And although I left when I was only 6.5 years old, whenever I return to India, I feel very much at home there. So it does feel like a second home to me. Mm-hmm. And also when we were there, I spent, most of my time with my Indian friends and so forth. And my parents recount that when we came home on a holiday when I was 3.5, I was extremely upset to discover on the ship that I wasn't an Indian. So apparently I was fraternising with the Indian deckhands and they informed me that I wasn't an Indian. I went to my parents and said, "Was this true?" And they told me, yes, that was in fact true. So I was very upset about that, and also I obviously identified with the place in some way because when I came to Australia, still a very young chap, I refused to speak English. So I would only speak in Hindi until my grandmother, who I was staying with, jacked up and decided she wouldn't feed me until I spoke English. So from that point on I started speaking English. But I think also India probably had an indirect impact on me through the impact on my family, my brothers and sisters who were older than I, and also my parents, who spent the best part of 10 years in India as missionaries. But I think the country had a big impact on them, and that probably indirectly impacted on me. And I remember my mother telling me years later that when they came home after 5 years in India, and you need to remember that in those days it was vastly different. They didn't have telephone or electricity, so it was living in village India. But when they came home on furlough for a kind of holiday, it was a profound cultural shock to them, and probably only then did they really realise the impact that India had on them. I remember my mother telling me that she was amazed and appalled when she got on the ship in Bombay, present-day Mumbai, of how appalling most of the white people on the ship were, because they were so racist and patronising and, kind of arrogant. And she also said that when she came back to Melbourne, they were expected to recount their time in India converting the heathens. And she said she felt as much as though the people she was talking to were the ones who needed converting as the ones in India. And what really struck her was, the decorum and dignity of the people in India and the kind of politeness and sensitivity that she found there. So although this doesn't explain my coming to Buddhism, it does explain, I think, part of the sensitivity to India or why it might have interested me. The first that I consciously remember becoming interested in Buddhism was at school, actually. And it was a very conservative school, but we had a rather interesting English teacher who used to bring up all kinds of subjects. And I think he had spent a lot of time in China, about 30 years in China. And he'd been at the school for a long time. I'm not sure that the authorities of the school particularly respected him, but he'd been there so long that they had to tolerate him. And he was the first one I think I heard something about Buddhism from, and also existentialism. And these two things struck my interest. And he actually offered to take special classes after school for a few of us who were interested in Buddhism and existentialism. But the headmaster of the school overruled it, said we were too immature to study these subjects. So I didn't actually get these lessons on existentialism and Buddhism, but I think that was significant, and that probably sparked my interest in reading a bit more on existential themes, shall we say. And I think that's important because existentialism, whatever its failings as a philosophy, is dealing with our concrete, immediate lived experience. So we've got to find meaning in our life, in our actual experience, not in some theory about reality, not in some kind of dogma, so forth. So this emphasis on lived experience I think was important. And I think that actually ties in with Buddhism, because I mean the Buddha starts with our existential situation. He doesn't start with a theory about God or a proposition about the nature of ultimate reality. He actually begins with the question of our suffering, our existential situation. So in a lot of ways it's a kind of existential approach in Buddhism. But I really became more directly and started reading seriously about Buddhism when I went to university, first year university in 1970. And it was tied up with the whole times. There was a lot of exploration of ideas, psychedelic drugs and all that kind of thing. And I, at that
time of the Vietnam War.
Also the Vietnam War, yes. So there was a lot of protests, the moratorium and so forth. So I actually spent very little time going to lectures. I was more tied up with experimenting with my mind, going to protests, etc. And I think that year I had a pretty serious existential crisis about who I was. And trying to see what I had as an identity, I couldn't actually find who I was. And when I read Buddhism with its doctrine that there isn't a self or isn't an unchanging self, I thought, oh, well, this is the answer. I'm looking for something that I'm never actually going to find. And these people, from that point on, I think I became convinced that Buddhism had the answer. I mean, it's a long process that I'm still working on, work out the solution, but I think that provided the direction for where I was going. So from that point on, my major kind of intellectual, probably existential interest was really Buddhism. And I dropped out of university because I was studying philosophy, which I found not very helpful. And I did psychology, which was all behaviourist psychology at that time, and that didn't really tell me anything about the human mind. And plus I was, if you like, still in this question about who I was. So I dropped out for many years and then went back to university about 7 or 8 years later, and they started a religious studies department at Sydney University. And so I went back mainly out of interest in Buddhism, but also in religious, spiritual questions. And also the philosophy department had changed dramatically in that time and had broadened out, so they'd introduced continental philosophy and a much more, shall we say, existential approach, because continental philosophy in general is concerned with our human situation, not with an empirical investigation or a purely logical investigation. So I had the opportunity to study Buddhism, but I also had the opportunity to study Western philosophy in a much more, to me, meaningful way. And then while I was at university, I got the opportunity to study a bit of Sanskrit, which I didn't think I'd pursue to any great extent, but I fell in love with the language, and that became my major focus for about 5 years, studying Sanskrit. So I went to ANU and did another degree in Sanskrit, came back and finished my honours in religious studies, then did a PhD in Sanskrit and Buddhist philosophy. And then more by chance than anything, an opportunity came up at Sydney University where they were looking temporarily for a Sanskrit lecturer. So I took that initially on possibly a one-year basis, and then while I was there, the professor who had established the religious studies department retired, and they needed somebody to teach Buddhism and Hinduism courses. Anyway, the upshot of it all was that I ended up with two half-time positions, one in religious studies at Sydney University, basically teaching Buddhism and Hinduism courses, but I also got involved in teaching methodology in the study of religion, and so that was half of what I was doing. And then on the other side I was primarily teaching Sanskrit, the classical language of India, but I also had one unit on the Asian studies side on Indian philosophy. Anyway, it turned out that the Indian side was such a lot of work that my full-time position ended up in Asian studies after about 5 years. And I developed some new courses in Buddhist philosophy, which were also taught in the cross-listed with the philosophy department. And then we developed a Buddhist studies program. So the final years at the university before I retired, I was in charge of a Buddhist studies program at Sydney University. And for a time there we had a master's in Buddhist studies, but it's no longer the case. So a large part of it was teaching Sanskrit, really. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you for drawing out that distinction between how existentialism relates to Buddhism, starting from our own experience. I think that's a key point. That's one of the entry points that I actually entered into Buddhism from, which is a very interesting overlap between Western philosophy and, I suppose, the method of Buddhism.
Right.
So as Buddhists, or people who are interested in Buddhism, why might we be interested in comparing Western philosophical thinkers and Buddhist thinking, as I think myself and other people such as yourself have done over the years? Why might some people be interested in this comparison or overlap between the two?
Yes, well, it's a very good question. I'll answer that more directly, but as a point of interest, the reason I began teaching at Kaju Ivam was when I had the position at Sydney University. Tralag Rinpoche came along and we invited him to come along and talk to our Buddhism class. And when we went out to lunch afterwards, he said to me that he liked people, or he liked the idea that we not only had an idea of what traditional Buddhism was, but a broader perspective, and he very much liked the fact that I had a kind of broader view of Western thought and Western philosophy that I could bring to bear. Was specifically for that reason that he asked me to come and teach, and for the first few years when I used to come down every year, and for the first several years at Carlton and then later on at the Buddhist summer school. So he liked the idea of both being aware of the Western side and the other side, but he also liked the idea that we have more than one perspective. Like he liked people to get a traditional kind of view, so he respected the tradition, but he wanted them also to have a broader view. So there's that angle to it. And then we could say probably several other things. I mean, as Westerners, we've been brought up in a Western cultural environment, and although we mightn't say have studied philosophy, a lot of our ideas that inform our culture are the kind of issues that have been dealt with in philosophy. So really, to understand ourselves and what we bring to when we study Buddhism, it's very helpful if we understand what might lie behind our thinking, even if we're not consciously aware of the influence of certain lines of thought. So we need to understand ourselves, I think, and then we can have a more authentic engagement with Buddhism. Another thing I think is, it's often said that Westerners lack faith or confidence in the tradition, and I think that is true, because the prevailing tendency is to skepticism, shall we say, and to nihilism. So that is a weakness, but a kind of strength of our upbringing is that we're taught to think critically. So if we can bring that critical ability to our study of the Dharma, then we can actually turn it to a positive effect. So rather than trying to turn off our critical mind or stop asking questions, if we ask deeper questions, then that can help our study of Buddhism. And then another thing is that I think in the modern world and the postmodern world, the dominant factors have come from the rise to dominance of science. Not only the incredible impact of science, but science as a kind of touchstone of what's true or what's real. So in our society, the dominant idea about what reality is drawn from scientific thinking. And that applies not only to Europeans, that applies through the entire world. So, Chinese are mainly thinking in terms of scientific, technical thinking. They're not thinking in terms of Lao Tzu and Confucius so much. So it's important to, understand, if you like, the position of the entire world, where we're under this dominant picture of science and a kind of utilitarian view of the world, where the main thing that counts is how efficient something is, how productive it is, how much wealth it produces, and so forth. So I think part of studying philosophy is understanding our kind of world cultural situation, shall we say, and then we can bring that to our connection with Buddhism. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, for example, about the relationship of Buddhism and science and meditation and so forth. So if we have some greater understanding of the role of science and the kind of philosophical thinking that lay behind it, then we can also bring a more informed discussion to that particular dialogue, rather than thinking, isn't it great that we need to confirm Buddhism by science? I mean, that's a very doubtful proposition. I mean, do we seek our credibility through the dominant paradigm of the present age? That doesn't mean that we should ignore the science side of it, but we need to be aware of how that's bearing on our thinking and how we think about Buddhism. Because, when Buddhism became known in the West, particularly, say, from the 19th century, a lot of the attraction to it was that it was seen as kind of rational and scientific and philosophical and critical and so forth. And then Buddhists themselves, even in Asia, in order to understandably promote their own tradition, more and more presented Buddhism in that light. So they say, well, this isn't a religion, this is a philosophy, or this is a science of mind, and they very much emphasise that side of it. Now, them saying that it's a science of mind, it's philosophy, it's a way of life, that's not incorrect. But we're heading towards a particular way of viewing Buddhism that might not be entirely balanced, shall we say? So if we bring your original question was about philosophy, I think. I mean, philosophy is very much connected with all of these issues, and since the time of Descartes, really the beginning of modern philosophy, there's been a kind of close connection between philosophical thinking and science. It's often been, how can the two be compatible? How can, in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, for example, was how can we get a picture that's more or less in line with the latest findings of science, that gives a rational account of knowledge. So by studying philosophy, we can become aware of all of those issues. So I think, well, for me personally, it's been tremendously valuable.
And you've also mentioned that philosophy to say philosophy is not helpful or not useful, or it's pointless to think about these abstract ideas like what is the meaning of life or what is the nature of the self. You've mentioned to disregard or undermine the importance of asking such questions is itself a philosophy.
Yes.
So from that point of view, it is inescapable in a sense.
That's right. That's right. Yes. So I think I said in one of my talks that if you say these kind of questions are meaningless, whether you like it or not, you're already doing philosophy, because you are pronouncing on what meaning is and what value is. So you can't really get out of it, I think. I mean, of course, you can, if you like, not get too much caught up in it, because I mean, part of what the Buddha did was in a way sidestep some of these philosophical or metaphysical questions. So, part of his skill was in dealing with our concrete situation rather than, abstract philosophical questions. So you may be aware, or you probably are aware, of his Buddha's noble silence. There were various questions that he was asked about. And, for example, did the Tathagata, that is the enlightened one, did he exist after death, or did he not exist after death? The Buddha didn't enter into a philosophical discussion about this. He maintained what's called a noble silence. He didn't say anything. And he was also asked, did the world have a beginning in time or not? So instead of going into a metaphysical, philosophical discussion, he maintained a noble silence. And of course, as I think I also mentioned in the talk, people said, well, what's the meaning of this noble silence?
Philosophizing about...
Yeah. And you could say that important strands of Buddhist philosophy, like particularly Madhyamaka philosophy, come out of an answer to this kind of question. What did he mean? And it impinges on the whole Buddhist way, which is avoiding eternalism on one side and nihilism on the other. So, but yes, to get back to the original point, you don't have to maybe spend a lot of time considering philosophical questions, but some kind of philosophical position or some kind of base understanding is going to be behind the way you relate to the world and what you think makes sense, or what is obvious to you.
Yes. Now, you've given talks at Idam Institute, as you've mentioned, and in one of those series of talks was on the topic of environment and economy. In those talks, you mentioned Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, who was in some ways critical of Western philosophical tradition as he saw it at that time. Might you like to say something about his critique about some of the ways that Western philosophy he saw had gone wrong, and how he might have opened up new avenues for Western philosophical thinking with his work on being in time and his invention of a multiplicity of different kinds of words.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, I think Heidegger is a particularly useful example for people interested in Buddhism. And he did several things. One of the things he did was provide a critique of the whole Western philosophical tradition. And I think the way he presents things is in many ways in tune with Buddhist thinking. So he provides a useful kind of bridge between Buddhist thinking and Western philosophical thinking. And there's the whole question of to what extent he was influenced by Buddhism, which I won't go into here, but there is undoubtedly some influence there. And he certainly had Japanese students studying with him, and he was definitely interested in Chinese thinking and so on. So there's probably a significant influence there. But leaving that aside, he criticised or looked into the whole history of Western philosophy and provided a critique of it, and he believed it had gone off on the wrong foot on a few issues. And one of them is this question of being and time. So the question is, what is being, or what is it that allows the possibility of everything existing? You know, how can we explain existence? So he said, we're struck by the fact as human beings, or if we're aware of our humanity, of the whole question of what is being, what is existence, why does anything exist at all? And he believed the dominant way of working in the Western tradition had been to find some ultimate being, the being from which all other beings came. So, and usually that might be understood as God. So we can explain all being in terms of God. So the problem with that is that you end up in a kind of dualistic position that there's God and then, you know, the world that's separate from God. And he believed this was a kind of mistaken way. It leads to a kind of alienation, shall we say. So he looked into this whole metaphysics of this question of being. And his argument was that what allows things to exist is not some other being, not some ultimate being, but it's more like an openness or a no-thingness. It's not what makes existence understandable is not another thing. We have all the things of existence, but what makes them all possible is more like a no thing. And I think this helps connect with Buddhism, this idea of shunyata or emptiness. So, you know, to understand what makes everything possible, it's not some ultimate existence or some other existence, it's actually the open dimension of being or the no thing. And so it was a whole critique of the Western tradition of being. So that was one side of it. And another side of it was he said that Western philosophical tradition has always been wanting to explain things in terms of substantially existent things. So the world is made up of a multiplicity of things, shall we say.
Substance being
Substance.
Inherent existence.
Yes, that's right.
Things.
Yes, that's right. So, you know, like a chair has an individual existence, or a person has an individual existence, and they all exist separately from each other as individual existence. And Heidegger was very critical of this, carried out a critique of this whole notion of substance, and believed that things don't exist like that at all. So he's undermining the notion of substantial existence or self-existence. And this also, I think, ties in closely with Buddhist philosophy, which rejects the idea of self-existence or independent existence. So in Buddhism, the key idea philosophically, or one of the key ideas, is dependent origination. And it's only in independence on everything else that things exist. It doesn't make sense to talk about something existing you know, by itself as a separate individual thing. So, I mean, I think the Buddha's key kind of philosophical insight found in all schools of Buddhism is dependent origination. So things don't arise from something else, like God, that would be eternalism, but nor do they arise by chance, that would be nihilism. So how do they actually come about? They come about interdependently, in independence on other things. And so Heidegger comes closer to this understanding, and also he brings in the role of language, of how it's really at the way we use language that we perceive or take things to be existing independently by our labelling and so forth. So particularly in Madhyamaka, middle way thinking in Mahayana Buddhism, in the philosophy of Nagarjuna, he says about everything is interdependently arisen, and emptiness and independent origination are actually two ways of saying the same thing, because something that is dependently arisen doesn't exist on its own, so it lacks self-existence. That and then the term empty or emptiness applies to this lack of self-existence. So they're dependent on other things, on the whole network of conditions, causes and conditions, and therefore they are empty. Right? But he also says that they exist, or exist as individual things, because of our naming process. So these two sides are there, and these two sides are there in a different way also in Heidegger. I mean, back on the earlier question, what's related to substance as well, Western philosophical tradition is always kind of looking, or has tended to be looking, for the one thing or the ultimate building blocks.
Yeah.
What's the world built out of?
Yeah.
So you could be a materialist and you could say, well, ultimately it's matter,
Yeah.
which is a very predominant idea.
Yeah.
And you say, well, what about mind? We'll say, well, that's just a epiphenomenon of matter. When matter gets organised into an organism, and then consciousness emerges. But what is real is matter. So that would be one line. But other people might say, no, that's not correct. What is real is mind or consciousness. So the ultimate reality is mind or consciousness, and then out of that we get materiality. So what is ultimately real is one of those things. Or you might have a dualist solution, like in Descartes, that two things are real. The world that can be measured, which is out there, which is basically the material world, and the mind that thinks. So you end up with dualism. But whatever you're ending up with in all of these, you're looking for a foundation for what exists.
Yes.
So is the foundation ultimately God, some supreme being who completely self-exists, on which everything's dependent? Or is it the material world of atoms and so forth? Or is it consciousness? Or whatever. But there's always this search for, well, there has been historically this search to provide a foundation to existence and to provide a foundation to our knowledge. How do we know? How can we be secure and certain about what's real and what really exists? And both Heidegger and Buddhism are what we might call anti-foundational. So Heidegger is kind of arguing that our attempt to find a foundation to things, where we can find an anchor, whether it's in God or matter or somewhere else, is dominated our philosophical thinking. And it's limiting our understanding of philosophy, but it's also limiting our understanding of who we are, because we tend to see ourselves as one thing amongst the multiple things in the world, or we might see ourselves as subservient to God or whatever. But whatever it is, we're in that kind of frame of thinking. We're always looking for building what in philosophy we call an ontology. That's a theory about what is real or what exists. And then when we look on the Buddhist side, and particularly, I think it's implicit in all of Buddhism, and it's probably implicit in the silence of the Buddha, but it's most clearly expressed in Madhyamaka philosophy, middle way philosophy, where you could say that a central point of middle way philosophy is the attempt to find a foundation for things is mistaken. You cannot build an ontology, and every attempt that you do to come up with, a rational kind of picture of what is ultimately real will have contradictions. It will end up with problems. So Madhyamaka philosophy is interested in investigating the contradictions, exposing, this is what we call prasanga. So one particularly influential school of Madhyamaka is called the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which means the consequentialists, the people who look at your attempt to build up, a ontology, a theory of being, and then finding that it doesn't work because it's got inherent contradiction.
So Heidegger is trying to get away from this question of foundations, this question of ontological rootedness.
That's right. That's right. He believes that that's a limited approach, and that it has problems, and it also affects our understanding of what we are. So, you know, you mentioned...
As humans as well.
As humans, absolutely. So if we're stuck in a world of things, we tend to regard humans as things also. And if we get stuck in a kind of objective view of things, then humans become just another object in the world. And this brings to another side where I think Heidegger is very valuable and important, because he carried out, as part of his philosophical critique, a kind of critique of dominant scientific understanding, shall we say. And he kind of argued that we take science as the real view of the world. But science is actually based on an attempt to get an objective picture of the world, right? Something where we can measure and we can empirically verify, you know, our findings. We've got some publicly verifiable way of what we believe to be real. And Heidegger is saying this, then we take that way of looking at the world as the way the world really is. But what we've actually done is kind of limited ourselves to a particular way of looking at the world. And by doing so, we not only limit our way that we understand being, the nature of reality, but we also end up with a very limited version of what we are as human beings. And he's a kind of early writer in a lot of ways on what you might call environmental philosophy, because he argued that the end point of this way of thinking about the world, which is essentially a utilitarian way, because it's actually tied up with the idea of controlling and dominating nature and using it to extract wealth from, shall we say.
Thinking of the environment in terms of its utility?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And he was writing, and you remember he was writing, you know, back in the 30s. He wrote Being in Time in 1927. But he said the result of this was that humans will end up being, or already are, probably in his eyes, regarded as just resources, human resources. And that's a fundamental degradation of what it is to be a human being. For Heidegger, the fundamental question about what it is to be a human being is to actually be aware of the question of being, what you might call the mystery of being, which is a much bigger thing than how efficient you are in the world, or, you know, whether what you can draw out of, you know, see the environment totally in terms of mines, or, you know, how it can be turned into production. So he was critical of this way of thinking that have negative impacts on the environment, on forests, mines, etc., but also negative impacts on human beings. They will just be regarded as cogs in the machine of productivity. And he believed this comes out of a particular strands of Western philosophical thinking that were tied to the development of science. Now, Heidegger's not against science. He wasn't saying we should get rid of science. But we need to understand that that way of looking at things is a limited way of looking at things. It's not necessarily inherent in the nature of reality. It's like we've chosen to adopt this kind of way of looking at things, and we've almost made a kind of pact, you might almost say a Faustian pact, that, you know, we're going to trade our souls or our being for wealth. So, you know, what are we going to get out of all of this control that we're getting through this way of looking at the world, where we're producing cities and motor cars, etc.? But are we losing our humanity in the very process? So I think that's also valuable in terms of thinking about Buddhism. What's it really about? You know, it's to be, you know, to wake up, which is the meaning of the Buddha. It's to wake up is to wake up to what we are as human beings. And we're not objects, we're not things in the world. We're something much more profound than that. And I think Heidegger was aware of that, and he raised that question in a Western philosophical context.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that he was doing it within the tradition of Western philosophy. And you've mentioned in your talks that you know, he might have pilfered or drawn from Eastern tradition in putting forward his philosophy of being, but that you thought that you're not bothered by this because it's because he's doing it from within the tradition.
That's right.
And that might be helpful for others coming to philosophy and these ideas being adopted without the lens of religion, I suppose.
That's true too.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, as you've pointed out, I think, there are two sides to that. One, if he'd come out and say that, look, I'm putting some very useful Buddhist ideas here, he would have probably not been one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century.
Yes.
So he would have been committing philosophical professional suicide probably, especially back then, in the 1920s. But also it was kind of essential that he addressed these questions within the terms of the Western philosophical tradition. So it really wouldn't serve too much purpose by bringing in the Nagarjuna and so forth.
Yes.
So he really needed to look, at Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Descartes and this whole line of thinking, and then work it out within that situation. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Just one other point that I should mention. I mean, part of his appreciation of what he was aiming at, particularly in his later philosophy, was to become to a kind of different experience of the environment. Not just have some better idea about it, but actually kind of open ourselves so that we experience the world in he would never use the word himself, but in what you might call a more sacred way, or a more, I don't know exactly what word he'd be happy with. But, people have, although he wasn't working within the framework of religion, people have pointed out some similarities to some of his thought, to some mystical thought and so forth, and he actually used an important term for his thinking that he drew from the German mystic Meister Eckhart, and the term Gelassenheit, which basically means letting be or leaving things alone. And what he's talking about there is actually an attitude or a comportment of being where we're not, to use his word, framing everything in our conceptual thought. We're actually letting go of our conceptual thinking or our particular representational thinking and allowing things to be. So this letting be is a letting be in ourselves, like we're letting go, but it's also letting the sky, the sun, the stars, the trees, etc. kind of be themselves and speak to us, shall we say, or allow them to reveal themselves to us in a new kind of way. So I think that side of it also connects with Buddhism as well.
Absolutely. And might you like to say something about the I find it a bit of like an anti-intellectual bent sometimes, where people say in Buddhist circles, or some Buddhist teachers have said conceptual thinking is bad, or it's not useful, or we get into traps too much. Might you like to say something about how Heidegger thought that use of language, questioning things, can go that way, can get us into traps, but it also can be an expression of our humanity or our being.
Well, that's personally, that was one of the things I really appreciated in studying Heidegger, because he recognises this dual kind of function of language. Language, of course, we get caught in concepts, and those concepts limit us because we take those concepts as reality, particularly dualistic concepts. And as you say, in a lot of Buddhist talk, we're always worried about the conceptual mind, being caught in it, and this idea that we kind of get rid of it, and then, we see things as they are, without being trapped by conceptuality. And that has some validity to it, and a lot of Heidegger's thought recognises that. But on the other hand, Heidegger also recognises, and I think this is in Buddhism as well, but tends not to be brought out so much, that being a human being and being able to use language are very closely related. In fact, for Heidegger, they're almost the same thing. The fact that we can speak and use language allows us to ask these questions. And it's through language that we can even be aware of the question of being and ask, and then progress from there. So that language, as well as being a block, is also a kind of opening. And he's also interested in the way, not only that language blocks, but the way language can kind of reveal, shall we say. So he became very interested in more poetic language, shall we say. And his later philosophy was heavily influenced by reading poetry. So that language not only is a block, but the language can evoke this experience. If we use the role of poetry, or the role of, if we're not just using language, but human systems, cultural systems, art and so forth, they can actually evoke this experience of being, the mystery of being, or the openness of being, or if you like, from the Buddhist point of view, the experience of shunyata, the experience of emptiness. And the emptiness is not just a mere negation. The emptiness, using Buddhist language, the emptiness is also a luminosity or a radiance, where things actually show themselves in, their truer nature. So language can, particularly poetic language and so forth, can evoke this experience. So language also has a very positive function. And I think this is tied in with his interest in etymology, where he was particularly interested in Greek language and German language. He was always looking at the structure of words and where they came from and what they originally meant and so forth. And I think what he's doing is trying to reach back to an earlier kind of phase in language where it was tied up with an apprehension of the mystery of existence, not just a utilitarian existence, but something which more fully expressed our humanity. So he'd look back into the ancient Greek, and in particular he was interested in what's called the pre-Socratic tradition, so going back before Plato. When we think of Western philosophy, we normally think of it as starting with Plato. I mean, Plato was very interested in the question of being. It wasn't that he wasn't interested in the question of being, but according to Heidegger, he kind of took a wrong kind of direction, So, I mean, Plato was very interested in the question of being. So Heidegger's looking before Plato at the pre-Socratic traditions, what you might call almost the primal tradition in Greek thought, when probably people were more in tune with the natural environment and, more kind of intuitive kind of grasp of things, shall we say, where maybe the sky spoke to them more directly or something like that. And he believes that something of this experience is expressed if we look deep in the language, if you like, the traces of before we got caught in the web of language, or the net of language, the traces are actually there in the language. So some of his work is actually like an excavation, carrying out a kind of archaeology, looking into the language and where it comes from and so forth. So that's a very positive side of language in Heidegger.
And he considers that can reveal something to us of the nature of being, that excavating those the classical Greek and German can do that. You've mentioned in passing and this wasn't a main focus of the environment and economy talk, but that at the time of the Buddha there was a new kind of society developing that was leading to a sense of the individual as people were moving away from village life, and cities were starting to develop. And the Buddha was addressing these sorts of social changes, I suppose, that were occurring at this time, where people were moving away from an identity that was based in the village to one that was more individual, where people were perhaps living in cities. And this question of who am I and what am I was and identity was being addressed more at that time. So those questions, those more abstract questions, what is identity, what is self, and so on, you mentioned were tied to this, these sort of social changes, which also was tied to how we think of money, as well as a sort of abstract agreement that everybody. We don't often think. You mentioned this as well. We don't often think about money as being something abstract. We think of it as very material, solid. You know, got to pay the bills, that kind of thing. Might you like to mention something about your thoughts on this and how it relates to how thinking abstractly about money and identity started to develop at that time? And I'm not sure if there's a question in there. But
I'm happy to comment on
a few of those things, because.
Yes, well, I think, as I say, I didn't develop it in the talk, and it's not something I've done a lot of work on. But I think what was happening, if we look at the kind of social environment when Buddhism arose, was really the period where urbanisation was developing as a significant feature in North India. And I think, although the Buddha was a renunciate, he renounced his princely role and went off and became a renunciate. It was actually the merchants who bankrolled him, shall we say. The people who were interested in him were the people, in the towns. So this brings in that side. But the other side of that change was that it was a kind of move, I mean, not at all uniform, but from a more mythic way of looking at the world, shall we say. So we're not thinking so much in terms of individual identity, we're thinking in terms of our relationship to the gods, the forces of nature, and also probably more particularly in our position in terms of, say, the tribe that we're in, where we're basically defined by our social position, but also by our parents and, how we fit and are seen in the whole situation. And you could say that the time that Buddhism emerged, the Buddha was teaching, that more mythic side, which was the more agricultural side, was probably closely more tied to the Vedic tradition, which you might say is the early form of Hinduism, where your role in society, your social role, and your duty, which was defined largely socially. This word dharma in the Hindu context actually more relates to your social obligations. What's your dharma as a wife? What's your dharma as a cobbler, etc. So that defined kind of what you were. So this is probably more on that side, was more the Vedic side. Because what we call Hinduism hadn't really developed, but what we might call proto-Hinduism. And then on the city side, I think with people living in cities, but also dealing in commerce and so forth, so they're developing like a surplus to trade and so forth. So it's a more abstract existence, and the people are not so tied to their immediate social situation or their family or even to the land they're working on. And also, as you mentioned, money brings in a level of abstraction, really. So, I mean, you couldn't have a tribal society and say, all right, we're going to introduce money, but nothing will change. I mean, that would be a completely naive idea. As soon as you introduce money, there's a whole thing about delaying things and planning for the future and bargaining and all of this kind of thing. So it brings in a whole different way of operating. And I think with this changing situation, the question of personal identity probably becomes more important. Like, who am I? If I'm not defined by my social role, well, what am I defined by? And so probably a feeling of anxiety, shall we say, that the Buddha addresses in the First Noble Truth of Dukkha, because it's not just about getting sick. It's, the whole question of the kind of angst of existence, existential question, comes into it. So I think those sort of questions are much more likely to arise in a kind of urban environment or a more abstract environment. So in a way it's not surprising that the main interest in the Buddhist teaching was in the urban setting. And then with the backing of the merchants, it became predominant. But the other side, of course, is that the way Buddha taught about karma and general social issues, there's a lot more about determining your own destiny, shall we say. So, and he very much de-emphasised like your social role. There's a very strong recognition in Buddhism that its social arrangements are conventional. Whereas in the Hindu tradition, shall we say very broadly, your social position is basically part of the divine plan. So if you were born a low caste person, say, I mean it's related to karma, but the actual layout of society into different layers, of merchants and warriors and princes and so forth, is regarded as part of the original creation. So in the Hindu viewpoint, when the world was created, I'll just say as a parenthesis, there are a lot of different Hindu viewpoints, but in one Hindu viewpoint, when the world was created, not only did the physical world be created, but the social world was created with all its social divisions. So, whereas in Buddhist terms, and I think this relates more to the kind of society at the time, the social arrangements are a matter of human convention. They're something that humans do. And I think that's the reason why Buddhism could spread outside of India. It could go to China and then it could fit in with a Confucian social ethic. And it's also part of the appeal when it comes to the West. It doesn't bring a huge amount of social baggage with it, shall we say. So if we've got a more egalitarian viewpoint, well, we don't find any conflict with the Buddhist doctrine about that. We don't have to explain away that it tells women that they have to behave in this way or whatever. They say the fact that women were in a lowly position in Buddhist societies, which is undeniable, is not because of some doctrinal position in Buddhism. It's simply a fact of the way those societies operated. So I think that period in India was a kind of important period of change, and Buddhism with its more individual, what we might call existential approach, kind of tuned into that side of things.
And I just want to ask about Yogacara philosophy and its relationship with environmentalism and deep ecology, as well as Western philosophy, because Yogacara has been translated many times as mind only, and there's idealism in Western philosophy. I wonder if you could, if you might like to comment on the distinction between idealism and Yogacara philosophy.
Right. Yeah, well, you've actually brought up a few points there.
Yes.
Firstly, yes, it's true that
So Yogacara philosophy in Buddhism and the Western philosophical school of idealism have been somewhat conflated sometimes, or sometimes people speak of them in the same terms. I just wondered if you could draw some distinctions between the two, and if we could have some clarity on the two.
Yeah. Well, we most commonly refer to this school of thought as Yogacara, so we'll just deal with some terminology first. So Yogacara means yoga practice. So here yoga means just a discipline, shall we say. Some discipline related to liberation, shall we say. So it's the yoga practice school. So there's a big emphasis on practice. So it's probably more connected to actual meditative practice rather than analytic thinking. although it develops as a school of philosophy. So that's one term. Secondly, it's known as Vijnana Vada. And Vada means doctrine and Vijnana means consciousness. So it's the doctrine of consciousness school, or the Vada, the talk about consciousness. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but it's also known as Chittamatra. And Chitta is mind, and Matra means mere or only. So it's commonly called the mind-only school. So we have these three terms, and sorting them all out is quite a big question, but I'll just provide a few pointers on it. So you were asking about idealism. So it's because of this mind-only that people tend to say, well, Yogacara believes that the ultimate existence is mind, right? Mm-hmm. So the external world, if you like, doesn't exist. Yeah. Only mind exists. We have an appearance of the external world, but it doesn't actually exist. Mm-hmm. So they then say, well, that's like Western idealism. Mm-hmm. And the problem with this is that Western idealism has various varieties. So in crude thinking, you might say, if you know nothing about it, you might think that idealism believes that mind is the ultimate kind of reality. And so you say, well, Yogacara believes that mind's the ultimate reality, therefore Yogacara is idealism and is comparable to Western idealism. So if you wanted to unpack that, you'd have to look at what the term idealism means in the West. And I won't elaborate on that, but there are different types of idealists. So people say that Kant, for example, is an idealist. Mm-hmm. But Kant didn't disbelieve in the external world. Yeah. He just believed that the categories of our thought, our representation, determined how we experience the world. Mm-hmm. So in a way, we all experience the world through our categories, and Kant said, well, we can't know what the world really is in itself, because we only experience it through the categories of our thought. So Kant believed there was what he called a thing in itself, but we can't actually know it in itself. We can only know our representations of it. Mm-hmm. So that he's called an idealist. But he's not a person who's saying that mind is the only thing that exists. Then we have other people who believe that the whole evolution of the world is an evolution of spirit, identified with mind. So in Hegel, philosopher Hegel, well, in German Geist. Geist is related to the English word ghost, but not as in ghosts. It means like, spirit, like mind, shall we say. So for Hegel, the whole kind of evolution of the world was the unfolding of the Geist in history. So he looked at history and saw, it kind of has a direction, and it's all about the spirit revealing itself and coming to know itself. Now, this is a powerful kind of current in Western kind of thought. So this is another kind of idealism, that spirit is this ultimate reality that unfolds in the world. And just by the by, Marx took Hegel's views and said, well, that's a nice view, but he's got it the wrong way around. It's actually matter that's unfolding. Hegel got it right, but he had it the wrong way around. Matter is not a product of consciousness. Consciousness is a product of matter, but he still took over Hegel's view that it was all unfolding in history, and believed he'd found the laws of the unfolding in dialectical materialism. So it was still a Hegelian idea, but he was the opposite of an idealist. He was a materialist. So that's another view of idealism. And then you have a view like Berkeley, philosopher Berkeley, who's more along the lines that mind alone is real, and how, we have the external world doesn't exist, shall we say, or we have no proof that it exists, so why do we need to think it? So for him, crudely put, the only thing that exists is mind. So when they talk about Yogacara being idealism, I think they're often thinking of it in that third sense of Berkeley. So the question is that a useful way of looking at Yogacara philosophy? Well, it is and it isn't. It is in the sense that a stream of thought developed in India and then later became very influential in China that interpreted Yogacara in those terms, that mind is the ultimate existence. And so we could say this Chittamatra approach is that kind of idealism, shall we say. And this became particularly influential way of thinking in Chinese Buddhism. This was a popular idea. Mind alone is the existence. But if we look at the actual development of Yogacara philosophy itself, particularly in its early form, it's really, this Vijnana Vada is really about the way consciousness develops. And what they're really interested in is not really so much a theory about what's ultimately real, mind is ultimately real. What they're interested in is how subject-object duality arises. So the illusion from a Yogacara point of view is the split that imagines that I exist as an independently existing subject, and the world out there exists as an independently existing object. So what the early Yogacara is primarily concerned about is subject-object duality. And the terminology is quite revealing, because it calls, the term it uses for subject is grahaka, which literally means grasper. And the term for the objective world is graya, something to be grasped, the graspable thing. And what they're interested in is how we set up this split in our being, shall we say. And then we imagine that we exist independently of the world, and if we could kind of grasp it, or we could arrange it in such a way that we could attain satisfaction. So, you know, we could satisfy our desires, and in large measure that's the way we live. We think if we could arrange our lives, we could grasp things, like grab enough money, grab an ideal partner, grab an ideal place to live, then we'd be happy. So we're imagining that I'm here, the world's out there, and then I can arrange the world and then I'll be happy. So that's a dominant way. So, but the Yogacara point of view is that this split is actually mistaken. We don't exist in that way. We don't exist separate from the world, and nor can we say that the world exists kind of entirely separately from our awareness of it or our consciousness of it. But they're not necessarily saying that means that my consciousness is the thing that ultimately exists. It's like there's a ground, if you like, a non-dual ground, or not even a ground, because that's a bit ontological. There's a non-dual state out of which this duality kind of emerges. But in early Yogacara, they talk about dependent arising, which they call the Paratantra nature. Paratantra means dependent on others, para is other. And they say that exists. We can't deny that. This is where they differ from Madhyamaka thought. We can't deny that dependent arising exists, because their argument is, well, if there was no dependent arising, there wouldn't be anything at all. So there must be some dependent arising. But they say what's problem is that we then superimpose what's called the imaginary nature, right? So in early Yogacara there's this idea of these three natures. To understand reality, according to them, we need to take account of three natures. There's the Paratantra, the dependent arising, and then there's the imaginary nature, which is the fact that we impose dualism on it and we divide it up into things, and then we imagine we can grasp things out of it and control it. And then they have the third nature, which is called parinishpanna, which means perfected nature. And there's not entire agreement, but the way I tend to understand it is in early Yogacara, and it's quite clearly stated, the perfected nature, which is the awakened nature, parinishpanna, perfect nature, is when you experience the Paratantra nature without superimposing the imaginary nature on it. So you're not distorting it through your conceptual categories. So the Paratantra nature, when it's cleansed or purified of the imaginary nature, is the perfected nature. But the kind of more of the idealists in the earlier sense we were talking about, they believe that the perfected nature was, you know, the ultimate reality that existed kind of independently of the other two. And so that was your pure consciousness, shall we say, that existed as an ultimate existence.
Right.
And this is where we get Chittamatra idea.
Right.
And this actually comes in later, and probably don't want to go into it now, but I'll just mention it in passing.
Sure.
This comes in later in Buddhist thought in Tibet about Rangtong Shentong. Yeah, so the hardline Shentongpas, who you might call a kind of idealists,
Yes.
they believe that Rangtong, that really existed, and that was the same as our own consciousness. So that was the ultimate existence.
Okay.
Whereas the Shentong, isn't it? Yeah, they're the Shentong, sorry, I got it the wrong way around there.
The Shentong believe it's the ultimate existence.
Yeah.
As the Buddha nature.
Yeah, but they take it as an existent.
As an existent,
Yeah. I mean, I could elaborate on that.
No. Don't need to go into that
Yeah.
at the moment. I'll just ask a few questions about Buddhism and ethics, because you've also given a few talks at Ida Institute on ethics in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, practitioners enter into study and practice within three basic domains: ethics, concentration, and wisdom.
Right.
You might want to comment on the importance of ethics and how to think about ethics from a Buddhist point of view as opposed to ethics from a Western point of view. I know it's a huge question.
Yeah, it is a big question.
But I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that I suppose it's similar to Heidegger and his critique of Western philosophy, in that Western philosophers are trying to find the foundational aspect of metaphysics in that realm, domain of philosophy, whereas in ethics, I have the tendency, and I'm sure a lot of people who have done philosophy have the tendency of thinking, well, what's the basis for ethics? And might you want to comment on how Buddhists view that question of the ethical foundations? Like, how should we judge ethical actions, if they even think in those terms?
Yeah.
And how Westerns view that question of ethics at a ground ethics?
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think one of the points I made in the beginning of my talk on ethics in Buddhism was that ethics in Western philosophy has more or less been a separate branch of philosophy. So, you've got aesthetics and ethics and ontology and epistemology. It's like a separate branch. Whereas if we look at critical tradition, what you might roughly call philosophy in India, and particularly in Buddhism, they're very interested in epistemology. That's how do we know things. And you might say that Yogacara in its subject-object thing is investigating kind of epistemological issues. They're very interested in ontology, that is, what exists, and you might say that Madhyamaka is focused on rejecting foundational ontology, but they don't really have a separate kind of domain of ethics as a philosophical discourse. And ethics, as I think you mentioned often in the West, like other branches of philosophy, is trying to find what's the basis of our ethics, what's the ultimate foundation of what is good or bad, good action, how do we kind of find it? And if we take the philosophy of Kant, it was absolutely, because he ran into this problem with his thing, we only know the world through our representations. Yes. He said, well, hang on, how do we know about God? Yes. If we can't get to God, because he wrote this incredible work, Critique of Pure Reason, saying we can't use reason to argue beyond the world. Yes. Reason only operates within worldly categories of time, space, etc. But what about God? Yeah. Are we going to ditch God? But the out for him was ethics, morality, because he argued, well, we have a sense of what's right, what's right and what's wrong, and that ethic thing of it, that's where we connect with God, through ethics. So it becomes kind of very foundational, shall we say, and a big question. And then as we go later into just talking about Western philosophy for a moment, this basis of ethics in God becomes undermined. So, what are the basis? What is the basis of ethics? It's the whole question of, is it all relative? So in Nietzsche, for example, we find he wrote a book on genealogy of morals.
Yes.
So by using the word genealogy, he was suggesting that morality, ethics, if you like, it has a history.
Yes.
It's not, we tend, what he's kind of saying is we tend to think that morality has this objective kind of status and we could find out what it is. But he's saying, no, morality, like everything else, has a history. Yes. And he's going to expose the history, the historical nature, or another way of putting it, the cultural nature, because history and culture go together. Yes. He's going to expose that morality is actually a cultural phenomenon. Yes. It doesn't relate to an absolute. Yes. So, and I'm not saying he didn't have any morality, he was particularly interested in exposing what he regarded as the hypocrisy of Victorian morality. Yes. But it raises the question of what is the ethical basis? Is it a purely relative thing? Mm-hmm. So in postmodernism, following on from this Nietzschean point of view, there tends to be like no basis for morality apart from cultural considerations. Yes. So that's kind of how it operated in the West. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whereas as far as I understand, it was never really a separate domain of thinking in India or in either Buddhism or non-Buddhist systems. Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason, not the whole reason, is that all of those systems, apart from a few minor ones, but all the dominant systems believed in karma. And so they believed that karma was like a law, shall we say. Mm-hmm. It's like we have the law of cause and effect on the physical plane, mm-hmm. but we also have a law of cause and effect on the moral plane. Mm-hmm. And so the Buddhist systems and Hindu systems and Jain systems all accepted the notion of karma. Mm-hmm. So that's underlying it. And then we get to the question, and this leads more back to where the question started, well, what is the basis of karma? Mm-hmm. And part of the Buddha's innovation, for want of a better word, part of the Buddha's thinking was that he rooted karma in an intention. Mm-hmm. Whereas, say, in that point of view of the Jains, the essential aspect of karma, and Jainism and Buddhism were kind of developing as major systems at the same time. It's quite possible. It's interesting that both the Jain scriptures and the Buddhist scriptures refer to each other, even the older scriptures, so they were aware of each other at the same time. And it's even possible that Mahavira, the kind of modern founder, because Jainism claims to be much older, and probably is, but the kind of founder at the time of the Buddha, it's possible that they even met. But the thing in the Jain system was that karma was defined totally in terms of the act. And the Jains actually believed that karma was a physical substance. Mm-hmm. So if you did a bad deed, heavy karma would attach to your soul. Mm-hmm. And would literally weigh you down, and you'd sink down to a lower form of existence. Mm-hmm. So the act was absolutely critical. So this is why killing is the worst act. Mm-hmm. So in the Jain system, if you want to be liberated, because both Jainism and Buddhism were aiming at liberation from the cycle of birth and death, mm-hmm. if you want to be eliminated, you have to purify karma and you have to avoid accumulating bad karma. Yes. So, and because it's viewed in this physical way, you must severely modify your behaviour mm-hmm. in order to not suffer the bad consequences. Yes. So, for example, Jain monks and nuns, they wear a mask yes. to make sure they don't breathe in insects. Yes. Otherwise they'd be killing insects, which would be bad karma. Yes. And they also carry a brush. They brush the ground as they go along, yes. so they don't tread on any ants and so forth. Yes. And I remember I went to a Jain talk once, and at the end But just before the end of the talk, the monk who was giving the talk said, please don't clap at the end of the talk, you might accidentally kill an insect. So he said, if you want to show your appreciation, please wave your hands like this. We can see what lengths they go to avoid killing.
Yes.
And likewise, Jain monks and nuns won't eat anything that involves killing a plant. So you can eat apples, for example. You can eat an apple without killing the apple tree. But they don't eat like root vegetables and so forth. So this extremely limited diet in order to avoid killing. Now, so this transfers right through their system, and they also believe that you have to purify the karma. So you have to kind of burn the karma off your soul. You've got to avoid it, but you've also got to purify it. And so they practice asceticism, like fasting and so forth, in order to purify the karma. Whereas the Buddhist point of view, the Buddha defined karma in terms of intention. The root of karma lies in your intention. So if you tread on an insect, you may be guilty of carelessness or thoughtlessness. It's not a good thing, but you're not a murderer. To kill, to be guilty of murder, you have to have the intention to kill, you have to carry out the act, and then you have to succeed in killing. So there are these three factors. And so the intention is the defining feature, chetana in Sanskrit. So this opens up, of course, a lot of more flexibility in ethics, shall we say, because the critical factor in an ethical decision or in karma is what your intention is. So there may be circumstances where you do something that would be unthinkable to a Jain, but your intention is positive and it's informed by wisdom. It's no good just having a good intention and being completely without any judgment. So if you have the right intention and it's backed up by wisdom, then the karmic consequences are not there. So this brings in, a whole range of things about under what circumstances killing might be permissible. So you're probably aware that in the past lives of the Buddha, there's a whole range of literature about the past lives of the Buddha. Whether they've got any historical validity is irrelevant. They're kind of moral tales about previous births. And in one of those births, the Buddha or the Bodhisattva is aware that somebody's going to kill an entire shipload of people. And in order that entire shipload of people isn't killed, he actually kills the person who's going to kill them all. So from the point of view of a Jain, that would be a completely unpermissible action. Whereas in the Buddhist context, you have to weigh up the morality, shall we say, of that action. So what's found to be justified. So this issue of the intention is brought to bear on a whole lot of issues, like we've been bringing up on euthanasia, for example, and so on. And you can't always. When I gave that particular series of talks on ethics, which actually Charlie Rimé, that was the only talk which he actually asked me to talk on that particular topic. So I'm not an ethicist. I thought, I'll have a go. But there were a lot of people there who came. That was probably the most popular series of talks, and it was also at Melbourne Uni, so it wasn't so hard to get to. And there were people there who were animal rights people, and there were people there who wanted to know about abortion, and there were people who wanted to know about euthanasia. And there were people who were, what about Buddhism? What's Buddhist view of this? And so forth. And Buddhism can give some guidance on all of these issues, but it won't provide, like, the Catholic view of abortion, for example.
Might you want to comment on how this view of ethics ties into common ethical questions like suicide, euthanasia, killing in terms of abortion, and political action in terms of violence and things like that? People have all these questions when they think about ethics. Might you want to comment on how Buddhists would frame those kind of questions as opposed to other views of ethics?
Yeah. Well, if you're looking at some of these questions in Buddhism, you're not necessarily going to find totally clear answers, but one place you can look is in the Vinaya, the monastic rule. But the monastic rule is not just a list of rules. So the 250 or more rules that monks and nuns have is not a simple list. They were developed over the lifetime of the Buddha, and each rule was introduced, at a particular time in response to a particular question. And so if you want to get a fuller view, if you look at this literature, you'll get some more idea about the thinking, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's a story in there of a monk who was thinking that he would commit suicide because he was a drain, he was very unwell, and the monks were using a lot of time looking after him, and he thought, well, the best thing for me to do would just be to just check out, shall we say.
Yeah. This is because he was old?
I think he was ill.
Oh, ill. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this question came up: what was the morality of this monk? Mm-hmm. So this was rejected. Mm-hmm. It was rejected partly because this monk, the people looking after him, it was a chance for them to actually become more familiar with suffering. Mm-hmm. Was a chance for them and for him to realise that we're all dependent on other people. Yes. And that, if you like, our lot is in common. Mm-hmm. And it's also rejecting the possibility that the monk might have in his suffering to develop a fuller view of things. Mm-hmm. So for these reasons, it was completely rejected. But then there's another case, and I can't remember the details, I have to look it up, sure, where there was a monk who was actually arhat and, already reached the end of suffering. Mm-hmm. And he made a decision that he'd depart, and this was not regarded as morally, so you might say he committed suicide, mm-hmm, or at least he decided to stop living. Mm-hmm. And this was not regarded as morally repugnant, mm-hmm, because he had achieved his end. There was no loss in him departing. There was no further possibility in continuing that situation. Yes. So I don't know about the monks or nuns missing out on looking after him. Yes. So here we have two people who are looking at the ending of their lives, and in one case it was regarded as unacceptable, and in another case it was regarded as acceptable. Yeah. So you're not going to get a totally simple answer, yeah, to that question. Yeah. But in general, suicide is regarded as extremely bad decision, yeah, from a Buddhist point of view, yeah, and should be avoided at all costs, mm-hmm, particularly if it's done like that monk who ended his life. It was not out of despair or anything like that. Yes, yes. But I think there's a kind of idea, whether we accept it or not, in Buddhism, that every situation is workable, shall we say. Yes. That no matter how desperate the situation looks, there's something to be gained, mm-hmm, from it. Mm-hmm. And of course the human life is the best life. Mm-hmm. And generally, from a karmic point of view, committing suicide is regarded as dire consequences. You'll likely end up as a spirit or something like that. Yes. And if you commit suicide, chances of getting a human birth are minimal, shall we say. So suicide is definitely very much to be rejected. Mm-hmm. And the general view on euthanasia would probably be connected with that. Mm-hmm. So, but I don't think the Buddhists would ever take an absolutist position on any of these things. Yes, yes. And it's got to be, I think, ultimately an individual decision, an individual issue as to what's the best course of action. Yes, yes. But as a general, shall we say, working principle, the idea that, with skillful means, any situation can be profitable would be the guiding principle behind it, I think. So, you know, a lot of people, it comes up, you know, in a less drastic way in terms of their pets.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
You know, I have Buddhist friends who go to extraordinary lengths to, you know, not euthanize their cats or dogs,
Right,
and
right.
so forth, and, you know, want to avoid it at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I think it comes down to an individual decision.
Yes.
So I'm not recommending that one euthanize a dog or whatever, but I don't think the dog's got probably the same possibilities as a human being with working in that situation.
Yes.
So I'd say it's probably less of a critical issue, but I fully applaud people who make these tremendous efforts on behalf of their animals. So I'm not criticising that decision. Yeah.
And in terms of political engagement and social engagement in various political issues like climate change, obviously one of the big ones for everyone, but particularly of people of my generation. What do you see as, first of all, might you like to say what you think social engagement means? I suppose, to me, being a Buddhist is being socially engaged, but there is, different Buddhists who put forward the view that there's a socially engaged Buddhists and different types of Buddhists. Might you like to just comment on what you think social engagement means and what role Buddhists can have in being politically engaged?
Well, as a starting comment, I mean, one of the kind of very influential Buddhist thinkers on social action is the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And he always said there's no such thing as socially disengaged Buddhism. All Buddhism is socially engaged. So first, before you deal with the more political dimension of it, I think it's important to recognise that the notion that monks and nuns and people involved in Buddhist practice weren't engaged with their community is a mistaken kind of view. They were involved in all kinds of ways, and even in the life of the Buddha was frequently advised kings on political things.
Yes.
He was brought in to mediate in conflicts. So if he thought being involved, you know, in that political dimension was a complete waste of time, he wouldn't have done that.
Yes.
So, you know, even in his case, you know, the great renunciate, he is engaged with the community, and his opinion was highly valued. And the fact that he was kind of impeccable morality, completely devoid of partiality, put him in a unique position where people could trust him and, you know, trust his wisdom. So in that way he was socially engaged. And also, just in general on social engagement, I mentioned before the Vinaya. If you actually study the Vinaya, you get a much more, the Vinaya literature, not just the rules. If you study the Vinaya literature, you get a fuller picture of Buddhist involvement with society. The Buddhist Sangha, or the ordained Sangha, was far more engaged with the community than the kind of picture of the monk as a renunciate. I mentioned there's a sutra which is often quoted about, like, the renunciate should be a rhinoceros in the forest. A rhinoceros is an animal that has nothing to do with other animals, it's completely self-dependent. And quite a good book that I read recently called Family Matters in Buddhism. Interesting title because it's a play on words. Family Matters could be Family Does Matter in Buddhism, or Family Matters. Points out that this gives a completely distorted view or wrong view of Buddhist involvement in the world. They weren't like rhinoceroses in the forest at all. They were compassionately involved in the world in a whole lot of ways. So that's one side of it. Then another point is that basically Buddhism historically only really prospered when it had state patronage. So in a way, Buddhism, wherever it was somewhat subservient to the state. You know, depended on the king or whatever the ruling system was. So, for example, in Thailand, you know, the actual exams for the monks were actually set by the state, by the government, and they were very much subordinated to the state. So, in order to be successful, you know, coming up too much against the state apparatus would not be a way for having much future as a Sangha. So traditionally, we'd say that the Sangha was not taking on the state, historically. But when we come to the Western situation in Buddhism, Buddhism is, as it developed in the West, is very much a minority tradition, and it is kind of developed, particularly the people who are interested in, somewhat as a critique of the society, as an alternate to the dominant view. And even when Buddhism became known to thinkers in the 19th century and so forth, apart from the side of those ones who were viewing it as kind of scientific and so forth, there were others who viewed it as a way of providing a critique of the dominant, you know, mechanistic kind of society. And so it was offered as a kind of critique of society. So it's taking a more oppositional role. This comes up particularly in the Romantics, you know, the Romantic poets and philosophers, and they were very much opposed to, you know, the objectivity and the industrialisation, the overplay of rationality and so forth, which they saw as weakening the human spirit. And so they brought in what they understand as Eastern spirituality as a critique of the society. So Buddhism is somehow in opposition to the prevailing dominant norm. Same thing happened in America with the people called the Transcendentalists, people like Thoreau and Emerson. So they were against the Puritanism, but also the money economy. And, you know, Thoreau went off and built his cabin in the woods to practice contemplation. But he was aware of Indian thinking. He read the Buddhist texts and Hindu texts that were just being translated, and he said he went off to do something like what the Indians call contemplation. And he was setting himself up in opposition to the acquisitive business mentality and puritanic morality, completely utilitarian. So as Buddhism developed, you know, in the West, it has this connection with critique of society and opposition to society, and also being a minority tradition, more in a position to be critical, but also not dependent on the state apparatus for its continual existence. So it's in a unique kind of position. And we also see it, you know, later on, you know, like the beat poets, you know, Jack Kerouac and these people. See, they were criticising the industrial military machine of consumerist America. And where were they looking for their inspiration? Kerouac was looking to Buddhism. You know, he wrote the book Dharma Bums. It's all about, you know, he goes off to be a fire watcher and contemplate the world and understand Buddhism. But the thing is that they provided the basis for the whole counterculture. So the counterculture of the 1960s comes out of the so-called Beat generation, you know, Allen Ginsberg and so forth, and people like Gary Snyder, the poet, environmentalist. Well, Snyder went off to Japan and studied Zen Buddhism, and he's actually the hero of Kerouac in the Dharma Bums. The hero of the book is a fellow called Jaffe Ryder or something, which is actually Snyder with a slightly altered name. But the point here is that these people, and same with Ginsberg, Howl, his famous poem, Howl is an indictment of the entire society, you know. So it's drawing its inspiration from Buddhism. So we have this historical connection with the way Western Buddhism developed, with protest, and then part of that protest actually engaging in doing something about it. So we've got a different kind of tradition. So I would say that some degree of social engagement and certainly of social critique is part of the development of Western Buddhism. And I don't regard it in any way as a betrayal of Buddhism. It's just Buddhism in a different situation to say it had been in Thailand, for example. So we have this kind of unique situation in the development of Buddhism.
Yes.
Then there's another side to it. A writer and activist who's very good on all of this was a American Zen teacher called Robert Aitken. I don't know if you've heard of him. Yeah, and he used to come to Australia. In fact, I met him in the religious studies department when I was there. But he's very involved in social engagement on all kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. And part of his argument was that we live in a unique historical situation, mm-hmm. not just to do with the development of Western Buddhism, mm-hmm. but he said, well, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, there was a wilderness for monks to go to.
Yes. Yes.
But now we're in a situation where the very existence of wilderness is threatened.
Yes.
So are we going to just do nothing, or are we going to let the even possibility of going to a wilderness and leading an alternate life?
Yes. Yes.
So part of his argument is that given, if you like, the gravity of the situation, mm-hmm. we have no choice but to actually be, we have no choice to be actually engaged. Yeah. Yeah. And you might know the Trappist-run Catholic monk Thomas Merton, yes. who was actually in dialogue with Buddhists. Mm-hmm. He met Thich Nhat Hanh, for example. Mm-hmm. In fact, wrote a poem about Thich Nhat Hanh. Mm-hmm. Thich Nhat Hanh is my brother. Mm-hmm. And he recounts about, he was a Trappist, and Trappists have a vow of silence and they have a vow of stability, that they stay in their monastery, mm-hmm. they die in their monastery. Mm-hmm. But he recounts, I think it was him or it might be Robert Aitken, doesn't really matter, mm-hmm. recounts the entire Trappist monastery going out to join a protest. So they're completely breaking their vows.
Yeah, yeah.
And they said, when the world is in danger of nuclear annihilation, we can't just sit here in our monastery doing nothing. Yeah. And Merton is a particularly interesting figure because he kind of saw monasticism as a way where different traditions like Buddhism and Christianity could talk to each other. So rather than comparing doctrines, well, look, you have a monastic situation and so do we. Let's see what we have in common as monastics. And he kind of developed the idea that the monastery actually provided a critique of the values of the world, shall we say. And so he was, although he lived in his monastery and basically followed his vow of silence, he was very involved in various social issues and, engaged through writing and so forth with various people. And of course he travelled to India and met with the Dalai Lama and various people in India. Wrote a very interesting book called The Asian Journal. In fact, unfortunately he died in Bangkok, electrocuted in the shower. Yes. So that was the end of that particular dialogue.
I didn't mean to laugh.
Yeah, well it is a little bit, tells you something about Asia.
Yeah.
Whenever I go to India, I always turn the lights off before I get in the shower. I always think of Thomas Merton. So the point, that final point is, if the situation is like the whole environment is, the very possibility of us living is under threat. Yes. Maybe even monastics have some obligation to engage themselves in saving the planet.
Yes, yes. It's a very, very good point, and it's such an interesting take on the state support of Buddhism compared to Western tradition of Buddhism, American Buddhism, and Australian Buddhism, whatever, Western Buddhism. But I also really value Thomas Merton's approach of using the monastic tradition as a social vehicle as well. It just goes to show what we were talking about before, that monks and nuns were not and never have been disengaged or separate from the world or social issues. So, with that, I'd just like to thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you. Pleasure.
Taking the time, and we're looking forward to hearing more and reading the upcoming book from Platform Publications. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.